This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the topic is death, and I will be speaking with Julia Assante, a philosopher and intuitive, and the conversation will begin when we return. As I do with each interview, I like to begin it by giving the person or persons that I'm speaking to a few minutes to just tell a little bit about themselves, about what the subject is, and how they got interested in it. So, Julia, if we could just start off, I know you have a book and a website you've written about the topic of death. Can you give us a little background about who you are, how you got interested in the subject, and some of the specifics, your specific ideas regarding this?
Well, that's a tall order, Deb, and thank you for inviting me on. I've had a very stressful childhood, and that often produces in people certain advanced psychic abilities. That was always apparent, and it bothered me a great deal. Then I met a psychic. I think that was back in 1972. And within 2 years of having met her, I was doing it myself as a profession. I did 100 people for free before I took money. In the meantime, I got a doctorate in ancient Near Eastern archaeology and art history, published a great deal in that. But in that kind of milieu, in an academic milieu, one should never speak about this sort of thing. They say psychic stuff, mediumship, that is all very female identified and has a very poor reputation in academic circles. So there was a part of me that was shut down, a part of me that I very deeply believed in, that was, since the mid-70s, extremely active, that I had to basically kill off. When I got years later, I had such a startling after-death communication that lasted for an hour and a half. It was so startling. I thought, okay, one day I'm going to write a short book about it. So that day came, but it wasn't short. It's about 400 pages, and it's extremely comprehensive. And since that time, I've been really doing nothing but. Now I teach all kinds of psychic abilities in Austria, almost exclusively, and I do it in German now, which is no easy feat, believe me. I had to talk about brainwave entanglement in German, but I do it. I like to bring it closer to science, which is more than doable. Science being far behind what the truth or the realities are about these dimensions that interact with our own, these dimensions that we all have access to, and abilities with which we are born. And it's my deep and abiding faith in people, what we have within us, that makes these workshops so amazing. For instance, I even teach, words come in German, so once in a while I have to slow down, remote viewing. And I have more success with my students on the first day of remote viewing than military people have after a year of training.
Now, remote viewing, just so people who don't know what that term means, and you mentioned the military, I know during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had experimented with people psychically being able to like look inside safes and get secrets and whatnot. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's it. Remote viewing is a way of perceiving through sort of like an inner eye. What I give students are a set of numbers. 2 sets of 4 numbers. That's all I give them. And that could be anywhere in the world, any time in the world, or anywhere off the planet. It could be anywhere. I could be wanting them to go to the surface of Pluto, for instance. Or I could have them look at something from 1870 in China. Doesn't matter. And with these 8 numbers, they arrive there, and they don't know what they're doing. It's the purest form of psychic work I could find, and it lays the groundwork for everything else that we do in terms of after-death communication, which is my great love, healing, remote healing, any sort of telepathy work. It lays the groundwork because it's a really pure exercise. People don't know what they're doing. They are following the waves that these numbers give off, and they arrive somewhere. It's amazing.
Let me just
What?
ask you, you used the term after death, and most people use a term after life, and I've always thought after death was the more apt term because after there's life, and then there would be death, and then there would have to be after death. Do you use that term after death or afterlife interchangeably, or do you see some
Yes,
difference?
interchangeably. Yes, I'm very much against almost all the terminology, but I have to use it.
Uh-huh. Well,
I find the terminology, even the idea of an afterlife, is a misnomer. And the idea of an afterlife as a place where all the dead seem to collect is absolutely outrageously inadequate.
well, let me
Absolutely inadequate.
Let me just ask this because a lot of people who email me after they've watched something like this assume that either I know a lot of the guests beforehand or have read their books or watched their films or whatnot. And most of the time, that's not so. And I've just skimmed some of your work online and whatnot. Now, your book, and I'll have a link to your website and the book underneath this video for anyone who's interested after the show or whatnot to click on it. But I know you had said before we actually started that you consider yourself a scientist. So does your book then sort of take a more scientific approach rather than say that the stereotypical Victorian era idea of mediums and whatnot?
Well, very much so against that, but I mix the science stuff. Again, has some ideas that could fit with what actually is going on, how we create reality, what reality really means, what materiality really means. It has some insights to that, but not yet so far. I also take very strong social views. I mean, I am a social historian above all, and I use the way I operate is using texts and artifacts and whatever. I use everything and let the material speak. And with a million theories, I'm probably the only person who's ever analyzed the so-called afterlife with post-colonial theory, but I
Yeah.
have. And so I use that. I look at the historical formation of the afterlife, going back to Mesopotamia and Egypt, which are areas that in which I have my doctorate, and move it up to Judaism, where there were substantial changes and has caused a lot of problems. The reforms that were done in the 8th century, basically that the afterlife was shut down,
Yeah.
and that has caused a lot of problems for us. I also look at the social problems created by widespread and instigated, manipulated fear of death, which is absolutely everywhere, and it keeps us bound. It really does. It keeps us from realizing and experiencing our own inner freedom and our own inner intuition. Our bodies are really nothing more than time bombs in this very post-Darwinian materialistic worldview.
Well, let me ask you, since we're going to be talking about death, let's start with the thing that is opposed to that and life, and because obviously we can't really talk about death until we understand what life is. I know, for example, a lot of scientists have in the last few decades talked about life as we know it versus life as we don't know it. Hypothetically, for example, alien life on other worlds, or life even here, people have theorized that there's as much biomass underneath the Earth's surface as there is above the Earth. When you think of life, do you have this a more Eastern view of life as something that's inherent in the cosmos and the fiber of matter and time and space itself, or is it something that sort of just arises out of that in some kind of chemical brew?
No, no, never that. I believe that electrons are conscious.
Hmm.
Therefore, I guess, an animist. I believe that all things have a certain kind of consciousness to one degree or another, but they have it. For me, a rock is alive.
Well,
And I don't at all connect life with the body. That's one type of manifestation of it, but it is not life. What life is consciousness. And very often, consciousness, in whatever type, does not respect what the body does. People, when they die, don't necessarily die. People, when they are alive, can be dead, conscious in terms of consciousness. They can have crossed that line. So I'm fascinated by consciousness, and I think in a few hundred years, or maybe in 50 years, we'll have 100 words, different words that will define different types of consciousness. In the same way, the word energy. Oh, what are you talking about? Energy. Even prana is not the same as chi, for instance. I mean, they're different sorts of energy. We're in Stone Age here. And where I think, campaign the hardest, there's a tendency in afterlife studies in particular where everything's lumped together. All near-death experiences are the same. They are not in the least the same. What we read is usually very much padded, very slanted, but we should look at the cultural differences of near-death experiences, how they're culturally constructed, and so that we can understand what the underlying unity may be, if there is any. So I'm always looking at differences, and I'm seeing these differences in terms of afterlife accounts. When I have after-death communication with the people in Austria, it's very different from the after-death communication I have with Americans. It's much more conservative. These people reenact family life. It's conservative. It's
You mean the dead people that you're communicating with?
The dead people, yeah. But well, going back to what you said, Dan, for me, consciousness is all. We don't understand it. We don't understand how it interacts with matter, although we're getting closer to it. And we know that it does. We know that even chickens can affect a mother chicken robot. We're doing it all the time.
So let me ask you. Would you describe, if you can, and just to use some broad terms, are you more in sync, would you say, with Eastern ideas of cosmos and matter and consciousness and life and death, or Western, in the sense that you believe that there's a life force out there, and that you as Julia, me as Dan, and anyone else listening to this are just manifestations of some central thing? Or do you believe, as like say in Christians, that there was a creator outside of time and existence as we know it?
I don't like either. I'm not a person who likes to follow any tradition, and I don't teach traditions. I teach against traditions. The more we stay within traditions, the less we know. We're only repeating stuff where we need to follow our own intuition, we need to follow our own experience, we need to look at what's happening and then decide what it means, if we can at all. So no, I wouldn't align myself with either one. Obviously, I'm going to have more Western tendencies than Eastern ones because I am Western. Mm-hmm. And I'm aware of that. I'm aware of that as a limitation. I try to break it as often as possible. I try to get past that. Fortunately, I don't think about anything without incorporating at least 6,000 years, because that's the way I think. Well, I go back to the beginning of history in ancient Sumer around 3,000, 4,000 BC. So, and I think in those terms, big terms.
So in terms of death then, since we've just spent a couple of minutes here just talking about life, do you believe then that, for example, in reincarnation or some form of it, a cyclic, that whatever you are comes back, and if so, I guess I'll just let you explain what your belief in that manner is.
My beliefs I wouldn't call them beliefs, my observations about reincarnation, and I remember maybe 120 of my own, are not at all like anybody else's. I'm not sure that they're ever going to be popular. I haven't published them yet, but I've given talks about it. We don't have sequential incarnations. That's the first thing, because our incarnations spring from a region in which time does not exist. So our incarnations are in fact simultaneous. I have met one very significant incarnation of mine while I'm here on this earth, and so is she. And we both remembered our past incarnations together, and we have both had specific, real out-of-body contact with a future incarnation of the same name, same person named Bernard. It's a crystal clear situation that shows that consciousness does not respect time, does not respect our expectations. At the same time, there are people who incarnate without dying. They're a completely different group of people. They usually die in shock, they're either killed or it's in war or whatever. And I have seen this happen, especially with suicides, as a medium, where they're looking for somebody to come right back in. They never die. They come right back in, and they come back in with all the marks from their former former life. If they were shot in the chest, they may come back with a heart problem or at least some kind of a mark. I often think of Gorbachev, that he must have been killed by an axe anyway in the head. At the same time, we have that on one side where they don't die, and then on the other side, you, Dan, when you die, remain Dan. It's not that you dissolve and leave the afterlife and become your next incarnation. That's not at all how it works. The other thing you have to remember is that even given that there's no time, given that this is all simultaneous, we are already in our futures. We are already dead. We are already our future selves. We are already our greatest potential. We are already way out there.
So
all of that is for us available. So, and I have seen over and over again in an experience in my own life where a future version of us comes to us in critical moments to help us or to guide us.
So you would believe,
mistakenly call guiding angels.
So you would believe in what a lot of scientists propose is called the block universe, that all of space-time exists.
Block and multi-universe, both of these things are quite right on. They need a little bit of changes and refinement because they don't incorporate worlds of the dead, for instance, other interdimensional life forms that to some degree or another are materialized. It isn't as though there isn't any matter even in non-local realities. There's always enzymes, hormones, and whatever, electrons that fly around, yeah? They're used. But yes, I would say block theory and multiverse theory are two that approach what reality is. And it shocks me to no end that scientists, physicists can propose so much and yet will never touch the idea of death.
Okay, well, we'll touch upon that in our next segment, and we'll do that when we return. Well, since we've sort of laid the groundwork in the prior segment, let me just let's just walk through the steps. If someone is at the point of death, let's say they're at their deathbed. My mother, for example, recently died a few years ago, 6 years ago, and I remember when she was dying, she had to starve herself for 17 days because she didn't want to live anymore. She was 86, and so she was in hospice. And I remember she used to talk about a lady in blue who was sitting there watching her in the last few days. And but let's say if you got killed in a car accident right away, or you were dying of your own choice, like my mother, or of cancer, or the myriad ways one can physically die. What happens next? And does the way one die, in your view, is it somehow different from the person who's dying slowly of a disease versus someone who's just killed if a piano fell on them?
Yes. When a person dies in shock, they're very often surprised, sometimes angry. I've seen them walking around the streets. They don't settle. That's not always true. There is no one standard answer to this. Each person is individual. Each person has a different experience. Let me just quickly say that often with a car accident or things like that, they're out. They watch the whole thing from above. Someone usually comes and helps them. Very often. I've known really happy suicides, and I've known others who were miserable, can't believe the violation they've done to themselves, and have no real understanding of why they did it. I work a lot with suicides, by the way. They're usually fabulous communicators. Having said that, long debilitation, sometimes there's a longer rest period after, but not necessarily. If they believe they need a long rest, they'll get one. I've seen others that leave, and in 2 or 3 days, they are fine. Literally, not figuratively. And especially if they've been wheelchair bound or their motion was restricted in some way. There's no one answer, but there is one thing I can say that for the most part, they don't dwell on their deaths. They don't think about how they died, what it was like, what disease it was. They don't think very much about health either. They know how ephemeral that all is, and how psychologically based that all is, and that it's a choice or a creation for us. So very often they encourage us to stop thinking about it. It's not important if you were at the deathbed. Yeah? And I bring this up because mostly we have these obsessive grieving because of our fear of death to a great extent, because we are forbidden and have been forbidden historically to communicate with the afterlife, for many other reasons, for the situation that we have in terms of our neo-Darwinistic attitudes about materialism, blah, blah. But for all of these reasons, separating is more difficult for us than it should be. And one of the things that we do is constantly return to, say, in a car accident, the mangled body, or the grandmother spitting out blood as she's dying. We return to that and torture ourselves with that. That makes about as much sense as remembering your own child only at the age of 4 and refusing to think of them as the age of 5 or 6 or 7, or as they are now. So what I try to do when I work with people on a private basis, certainly in my teaching, I try to get them to have direct contact, and the purpose of that is so that they experience who that person is now. The dead people, well, they're more alive than we are, but the dead people they think of their deathbed scene, their illness or whatever, as almost like getting over a cold. Death actually becomes very easy, and they don't want us to dwell on it. When we dwell on it, we get stuck. What they want is for us to see them as they are now. In some cases, when a person dies by accident unexpectedly, they're dying, excuse me, they're dying to tell us what happened. They're so fascinated by it. People who drown can often be in absolute fascination with what's happening to them. So, there's no one answer to anything. People write me all the time, what happens to suicides, what happens. It's amazing how people expect there to be a standard answer. It's like saying, well, what happens to human beings for the last 100,000 years?
Well, let me ask you, because you had said earlier that you're not as akin or in touch with some of the Eastern ideas. I know Eastern ideas of reincarnation is to somehow attain betterment. Maybe it's starting out as a cricket, ending up as a rabbit, and then eventually a human, and then through several incarnations attaining some kind of enlightenment. You don't sound.
It's a very immature belief.
Well, you don't sound like that, so you don't see any purpose in life. It's just a thing that is to you, that life, existence, reality just is.
Of course there's purpose. We're born with it. I have a 2-weekend workshop. If I give it independently from the major course, it's a 3-weekend workshop in which we find out what those life purposes are and who we are as a mosaic from not only incarnations in the future, which I make all of my students do, incarnations in the past, but also what we call parallel lives or possible yous. They all play a role here. So yes, there's absolute purpose. We come in here for a specific reason, to explore something, to create something. Life is basically, existence is basically about creating and self-fulfillment of some kind. Like an infant fulfills itself by dreaming how to walk and then standing up or crawling at first. But that is an absolute earthbound, physical, inner urge to fulfill, right? So there's tons of purposes for being alive. That we don't live them, that's something else.
But my point is that each individual in your worldview has their own purpose. There's no deity or whatnot that says, Julia, you shall do this. This is your purpose in life.
No. There are suggestions. There's some pushing. If I teach healing stuff, which I don't do a lot of, but I do it. It belongs to all of this. Sometimes I see forms. Most of them are humanoid, moving around to pick someone out for training. Yeah, definitely. We're in constant interaction. We're under constant influence. We give constant influence out all the time. So, but no one makes you do anything. There's no fixed destiny. I mean, with all of this together, I think you probably have an infinite number of future possibilities.
Well, let me ask, because you mentioned science, what scientific tests or what scientific experiments have been done to try and confirm, for example, that someone who would be pronounced clinically dead by a medical pathologist, that something leaves? I know there's been like people who claim, like there was a movie like 16 grams or something, people thinking they could weigh the soul or something like that. What kind of scientific experiments have you been associated with or know about or know people who've done that would suggest that when the person is laid out on a slab at a coroner's inquest or something, that something moves beyond that limited mortal thing in space-time and gets recycled somehow?
I have seen nothing in terms of clinical research. In other words, research that is replicable, which is what's demanded in terms of science. It has to happen more than once, yeah? There is a way to do it. I have the instrument here in Austria. I'm not going to talk further about it. I have a physicist with me. We haven't, we do gather funds and create a center and all that. So it's a ways in the future, but it's doable. It's until recently, the social change, especially in America, it's not so much here in Europe, but the social change that's gone on in the States, the acceptance of after-death communication, I couldn't have done this 15 years ago. Never. Has also affected scientists. They're starting now to look at it. But as of maybe 10 years ago, or even less, 5 years ago, the mere idea of looking in that direction was laughable. It was enough to make a professor an outcast or a scientist lose his or her position. And that has to do with the stance. No, I believe more than any. Let me back up a little bit. In the 20s, 30s, 40s, the best scientists, Nobel Prize winners, and so far were examining after-death communication as a means of proof for survival after death. They were really committed to it. And people who were in technology, communication technology, especially someone like Alexander Graham Bell, they saw how close the telephone was to after-death communication. In fact, the telephone is still today the most used signal for after-death communication in dreams or metaphors, or dead people call you on phones that don't work.
Well,
it's amazing what dead people can do with phones. But anyway, the point is that after the war, and then comes the atomic age, and that's when we really got tight. That's when science backed away from religion or anything that seemed hokey or spiritual. I don't like any use of spiritual. I don't like the word very much. It signifies something that's other, and it isn't. And there was a real stance. This is the birth of the neo-Darwinism, the pure materialistic mentality. And in pure materialistic mentality, there can be no existence outside of the ego.
Well, let me ask this, because you said there's no clinical tests to prove or disprove life after death. But you had talked about being able to speak with people after death, and you had mentioned the planet Pluto. I just want to use two examples. Number one, because we're recording this in March of 2016, and it was maybe 4 or 5 months ago that a spacecraft flew by Pluto, took all these wonderful photographs that showed a lot of things that blew scientists' minds. It would seem to me that two ways to prove something beyond clinical stuff, but just by using communication with after-death beings, or even beings from another planet, say, that had superhuman abilities in terms of science, would be to say, okay, there is I projected myself out, and there's a bigger planet, as now presumed, beyond Pluto, and say
doesn't prove anything, Dan.
And but my point is,
Nico Swan did that 30 years ago.
well, but my
He
point.
saw Jupiter, and scientists didn't find out that he was right for 10 years.
But I mean, if there was a specific event that could be proved, or vice versa, for example, if you communicated with someone with the dead, and let's say this person said that they had been killed by so and so, I would think they would be able to say, well, I was killed by, let's use a famous name, someone like Ted Bundy, before Bundy was known. Couldn't there be ways that you could prove death that way, by the descriptions given by the dead person that only they could have known at that time? You know what I'm saying?
If anything was known while they were alive, then someone else could have picked it up telepathically. This is a very specific criterion. I lay all this out in my book. So if somehow information can be transmitted even telepathically, it does not designate proof for survival. Period.
No. Why?
The only thing we can know is that if something happened after a person died that we can prove, such as and I found one instance of that from so much after-death communication. I spent 4 chapters on what means proof and what means evidence.
Okay.
And so a person who died lost his leg at sea. He wanted his leg back, and he knew who had his leg. It had washed up, and someone took it and actually buried it in their wall, because you have to do something with a human body. In those days, it was understood to be somewhat, it should stay consecrated in some way. So they kept the leg, and it was part of the wall structure. And this guy came back and said, "Where's my leg?" This happened in Denmark, I think it was, or Iceland, I don't remember. And it was a group of professionals who sat together every week. This is an isolated incident in which you can say that nobody knew that this guy lost a leg. It happened after he died, and he knew. And they found it. And he described his height and everything. He was extremely tall for his era. And it was that. It was a very, very large femur, long femur bone.
So let me just...
that could be proof, but nobody looks at it. Nobody even accepts telepathy stuff. Poor Dean Radin has been producing book after book of the most outstanding research. It's not accepted. And that's clinical research.
Dean Radin works for, I know the name, he works for some institute.
Noetics.
Yeah, the Noetics with Jeffrey Mishlove. He founded that, didn't he? Because I interviewed Jeffrey Mishlove.
He was an astronaut. He was,
oh, it was, okay, that was Edgar Mitchell. Okay.
Mitchell, right.
Edgar Mitchell, okay.
Because of his experiences in outer space.
Yeah, but just so I'm just trying to put this so that a lay viewer would be able to understand. So hypothetically, let's say if you or anyone else were to contact, say, just to use a random example, a supposed victim of Jack the Ripper, that person might be able to tell you, well, he had a mustache, had red hair, blah, blah, blah. But there's no way that the dead person could know that that was Jack the Ripper then, and therefore that wouldn't constitute proof because,
right.
Okay,
but any information that we get that could be derived by the living somehow, either through telepathy or some kind of precognition or whatever, does not count as evidence for survival.
Okay, well, let me ask.
You want to see the evidence for reincarnation? Yeah. Still disbelieved. It's unbelievable.
Well, let me.
And that some of that is spectacular.
Well, let me ask you: Are you familiar with a lot of current neurophysiology? Because I've seen, for example, online where someone will have, like, say, have someone look at a photograph of, say, Marilyn Monroe, some famous person, and they can then. I don't know how they do it, but they now have scans that you can look inside the brain, and you don't have a great deep focus, but you can see sort of that, oh yeah, they are imagining Marilyn Monroe within their mind. So given that the advances in technology like that, and that we will probably within, by the middle of this century, be able to, by scanning things, look into someone's memory. So let's say just a living person, you could, for example, if a woman was raped, that we could look into her mind and her memories, and we could get a much better identification of the face of the potential rapist. If that is feasible coming up, say, in the next few decades, is it possible, do you think, then, that same technology could be applied to a disembodied consciousness? Or is it specific to the brain, the physical lump in the head?
I wouldn't say the same instruments might be able to do it. We finally, science and many lay people have finally understood that everything we experience has an aspect of just pure electric or electronic impulses, electron impulses. Mm-hmm. And that's all it all is. What we see, what we hear, are the way the brain interprets electrical impulses. That's it. And I think one of the reasons why the awareness is growing so rapidly is because we're surrounded now by very subtle electronic impulses. With the computer that I'm working with, for instance, we're learning to read subtler and subtler levels of reality. That this art we call technology, art is really what's pushing us in a very different direction. So having said that, we can we have computers now that will pick up the electrical impulses of thought from someone, say, who's paralyzed. It goes into the computer decodes the electrical impulses and tells a robot what that person wants. Move my hand right. And it's done. This technology is all well and good, but I think you need something that is finer. This, when the dead are truly present, and it isn't just a telepathic communication, which is wonderful, but there is sometimes an actual presence there. My students feel it all the time. Your whole body is flushed with a tingling sort of electrical energy. It gets so heavy sometimes it's hard to sit up or even operate. That, for me, is a strong indication of presence. That energy, whatever it is, certainly has strong electrical components, can be measured. And but with the machines you're talking about, I don't think so. I think they have to be modified to focus in a non-material direction.
So let me just ask then, death as you see it would be somehow on another aspect of existence. It's not, it's sort like, you know, if we're talking about the physical material universe that Jupiter and Julia Assante and a red fox in the Arctic live in, do you think then that when the body ceases, or when the consciousness in this existence ceases, it's somehow like a mirror universe, you know, or some other aspect, and that these things are somehow like two separate bodies that interact and inform each other in some way?
I'm not really sure what your question is there.
Well, if I'm trying to get, because when you talked, you seem to be at least from my point of view, you seem to be suggesting that death is somehow a difference experientially, in that it's not necessarily connected with the same reality that we are. That it's some kind of extra reality. It's somehow supra, or somehow above, or somehow outside, and that these two states of existence somehow interact.
Oh yes, they interact. That's true. Again, there's no standard answer. There are people who die and don't know they're dead. They don't know it. Okay, and somebody's got to tell them, they refuse to believe it. Man, I worked with people like that. They refuse to go on. They refuse to give up. They refuse to believe it. So you could say that in their experience reality pretty much their reality, even though it's so supposedly non-material. We'll talk about that in a second. They're experiencing it in the same way as they would experience sitting in your living room, for instance. So again, until we understand how we create this reality, we're not going to be able to understand how we create realities in other dimensions. First thing is the idea of matter itself is rather bogus. If I took all the space out of all the atoms in your body, you would be reduced to a microscopic dot. There's nothing there. And I believe that within 10 years, they're going to find out that what they think is matter in an atom will not be matter either.
Well, there is a theory that
we are basically illusions. You can call that a Maya type of idea. I like to think of it more as something that is less dreamy, but it has to do with gestalts.
Well, you had mentioned earlier the difference between Americans and Germans in regard to death. Let's take cultures that are even farther apart. Let's take sort of typical Western European American type culture versus, say, more Orientalist traditions versus, say, more primal shamanist traditions, say, in Australasia, or some Native American tribes. How do their ideas of death, does the experience of the recipient of death in those cultures differ from one another, and how are they similar?
It's massive. It's massive.
But why would that be if it's...
It's in Thailand, I think they have something like 17 different types of souls. 17 parts of a soul. In my own research in Mesopotamia, they've got 4 or 5. They've got 4 or 5 in Egypt. It's massive differences, and those differences keep changing because what we were in the Victorian era, there were conferences trying to decide whether women had souls.
Huh.
So we're always on the move. We're always changing. Now we're talking about animal souls. I can't wait till we talk about the soul of a rock.
Hmm.
So again, the differences are enormous. I can't vouch for a Siberian shaman. Their beliefs are going to be as culturally bound as anybody else's. The near-death experiences, for instance, in India, are bureaucratic. People die, they end up in like this giant office room situation. Some clerk goes over with a list, pronounces his name. The guy says, "No, my name is pronounced Chowdhury, not Chowdhury, let me turn that off." And the guy says, "Okay, you're the wrong person, go back please quickly." No choice, no beauty, nothing. Excuse me for a minute.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean about our creation of reality. We create according to expectation, and we create according to what is doable within our own social world. So that somebody who is raised by a wolf will have a whole different set of senses from what we have.
So let me just ask you. So if let's say you were born and raised as a Sikh in northern India, and let's say you were raised as a Southern Baptist in Texas, and say some other minor cult up in Scandinavia, you're saying then that that person's beliefs would shape their belief of the afterlife, but wouldn't that then preclude then the Sikh from ever becoming, the Swede and his belief systems, or what I'm
No,
saying? Well, why wouldn't that if they don't believe that? If they're shaping their reality?
well, incarnation doesn't come just from our desire alone. It comes from a bigger place, that which more or less births us. I don't like the term, but I call it our oversoul. And we are, like you think of a light bulb, we radiate out in all different directions that are basically different in psychological qualities and in terms of intensity, and they are materialized in our world in terms of time differences and space differences. So it's when you pull back and you start to look at your incarnations in terms of groups, then you start to see what's really going on. My themes go for 5 or 6 different incarnations in one direction or another, in which I take a select portion of themes and explore them, create with them, whether experience is experience. There's no value judgment attached to getting a sickness as an experience. We don't get sicknesses, we make them. So there's no experience, it's not a negative experience to the greater self. So it happens all the time that somebody, it's not that we're not attracted to certain regions, we are. And you see misfits, people who were killed, for instance, in World War II, who pop from Japanese, who end up being reborn in Bali bodies. These are the ones who are not really dead, and they hate it. They long for Japan. It never goes away. Most of them go back. So, but in the general scheme of things, what serves the filling out of experience is where you go.
Well, so let me just go back to what we hear in the West when we think of classic near-death experiences. Since you had spoken a little bit of that or mentioned that just briefly, the general thing.
There is no classic near-death experience. That is a publishing phenomenon.
So you mean that's just a myth that people have lied about?
That's right. Yeah, there's a lot of really heavy-duty negative ones out there. The tendency is to standardize them, give them the best possible face.
So the whole going towards the light, seeing the Buddha or Jesus or whatever it is, you don't believe in that. So you.
Of course, I believe in it. Of course, I believe in it, and I believe that these are genuine experiences, but they are not across the board.
Well, I have read. So you're saying, for example, some people would have hellacious experiences, going to some kind of hell or Tartarus or Hades.
Why is that less real than having experience of this so-called being of light, which is probably your oversoul anyway? But go ahead.
Yeah, no.
Why is that different?
No, I wouldn't think so.
Experience is experience. What is real and what isn't? especially in non-local dimensions.
Right, but why would someone then be creating their own experience like that, or would say someone? Well, I'm just to use the classic example, someone like a Hitler or a Stalin, if they had had a near-death experience, would they have been more likely or susceptible to go into to some kind of purgatorial existence because of all the people who they harmed in their, millions of people that they killed or harmed in their lives? Or is that something that if they were comfortable with it, they would be just as apt. You know what I'm saying? A lot of religions, a lot of faith-based thoughts is based upon the idea of good and evil and being resolved at death, whether it's at a resurrection or someone coming to cleanse the soul with it. So someone who was that evil. Just to use the famous examples of a Hitler or a famous serial killer or something, would they be somehow expunged in their next life, or would they be somehow crippled? Not physically
I
crippled,
know
but
of one. I know of one instance of a man who killed a couple of children, and they came to him on the deathbed to forgive him.
are you talking in a previous life or?
No, as he was dying, these dead kids showed up to forgive him before he died. Listen, the whole law is forgiveness. There's nobody pays. You pay if you think you should. And I've always heard, and I haven't found Hitler. I've looked for him, God knows, because I'm drenched here with Hitler information. And I could talk years about Hitler, by the way, and in terms of the greater purpose for this guy, what he achieved for us. As awful as it sounds, a lot of good changes came about because of him, as a reaction to him. But I've always heard he's doing okay. There's no remorse. People have tremendous remorse after they die for what they did. Very often, I've seen people who are in self-made hallucinations of hell, and to get them out of there is nearly impossible. You can do it. I've been asked to do it by other dead people, so I do it. But I don't really do it. I get somebody else on the other side to do it. They work with me, and we spring them. So, yeah, I tried to tap into Hussein as he was executed, and I was met with such tremendous fear. And there's an example of somebody who really feared what was going to happen to him. It was so blinding and so it paralyzed my whole body. I couldn't go any further. The fear was tremendous. And what kind of reality he's made for himself, I have no idea. But the point is, given that we all had perhaps hundreds, if not thousands, of past lives, all these parallel realities that we have, how many components that exist, which exist in each of our personalities. We've all done some pretty wretched things.
So
we don't necessarily get better with every incarnation. That's a time-bound thought. I have incarnations behind me that I'm much prouder of than mine today.
So your idea then is that the cosmos or whatever reality is, there's no sense of karma as a lot of Eastern religions believe, and there's no sense of justice. These are man-made precepts.
Right. Karma is definitely man-made. There's lots of research there, not lots, but there's no evidence of it. No evidence of karma. Understand, again, what happens in places like India, class formations, and being able to hold down, look at this massively hierarchical culture, which is why they did so well with England. And how to hold down masses of people is the explanation comes from what happens after you die and how you incarnate and karma and all that junk. And none of it's true. None of it. And the same way, Christianity has its own ways of controlling people from the afterlife. Only religion can do that. Look at what jihadist Islam purports. I've never yet found out what happens for women if they've, sacrificed themselves with a bomb. But these are ridiculous notions, and it's shocking for many people who believe in them. It's shocking to them when they pass over and realize that they have followed and dedicated their lives to nonsense. It's very hard for them. Some of them go into rages.
Well, let me ask, if you're a person and if we accept, say, your life view that there is reincarnation and that people don't in any way suffer any ill effects of what they do, what would be there
I
to
didn't say that.
okay, well, let me
I didn't
just
say that.
finish what I'm going to say. What would
Okay.
then be the constraining factor on someone to be good or to have ethics? You know,
Lack of fear. When we don't have fear, then our tendencies for the natural good comes out.
so you think
We
evil
have to
springs out
know.
of
We have to
fear?
know better how the psyche works. A great deal of what we do that is considered criminal or devastating to others, harmful to others, a great deal of that actually has a distorted good intention. Somebody hurts somebody else because that person himself, the attacker, feels helpless, powerless. So the intention is to feel more powerful. That in itself is not a bad intention. It's misplaced, and it's a reaction. Our society has a lot at fault in terms of what choices that we make, and the fact that we don't look at how the psyche works, how we get into these influences, how we get into these ruts. We do pay for it, but who punishes us is ourselves. Believe me.
But then how
It's
would
not out there. There's no judge out there.
yeah?
We're
Well,
our worst judges anyway.
let me just ask then. And because I know a couple of days ago, my wife was telling me she got forwarded something on Facebook. We live in Texas, and in Houston, apparently some sick psychopath molested his 2-year-old niece and ended up giving her AIDS and chlamydia and whatnot. And so we're dealing with someone who's most people in most cultures would say this is a reprehensible pedophile or whatnot. And we can say, well, he felt bad about himself and he wanted to dominate, impose his will on this child who probably doesn't even have a real sense of themselves at 2 years old yet. But in your worldview, it would seem then that this person, even if he goes to jail and or get the death penalty or whatnot, ultimately, if he's good with what he did, then he sort of skates with the consequences, cosmically
No,
speaking.
no, no, no. People generally, when they die, unless they stay really locked up and they can even maintain their repressed energy or repressed memories, that can all still happen after they die. But most people become accountable. Most people have a very strong self-realization. There's also a life review process which could last, in our terms, hundreds of years.
But who's the counter? You said accountable. You said
they're self-accountable. There's not a lot of dishonesty in the afterlife.
Well, let me just ask.
They know what they've done.
But let me ask. So, if you had someone like this pedophile or someone like a Saddam Hussein, people that we would say clinically might fit the psychopathic personality, you're saying once you get into some higher plane, that psychopathy, that miswiring of the brain is somehow gone, and they can say, "My God, I gassed 10,000 people in a small Kurdish town."
That's right. Now, again, we can't make generalizations about anything, but yes, of course it happens. Let me just say, our world, as we know it, has been running on the punishment system for how many thousands of years? Has it ever worked? No, never. And as everyone knows, you go to a prison, you see what happened to these people in childhood. It's just mind-boggling. Help them with that. That'll stop their criminal self. The more we let go of our fear, the more we can enter into our authentic emotions, the less likely we turn to our natural morality through forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness. Self-forgiveness can create or promote our natural morality like every other damn animal in the world.
Well, I would just, one thing I would reply to, yes, I would agree with you that punishment isn't going to help, say, a psychopath who's a sexual psychopath who there's something wrong with their brain.
It doesn't help anybody.
But
And it doesn't
I would
further
say
our
on a material sense, if let's say the state were to execute, say, like a Ted Bundy hasn't killed again, at least not in this life. Ted Bundy is not responsible for any murders. Maybe a future carnation, there could be a 30-year-old Ted Bundy. I guess he was killed in what, the the late 80s, or maybe 25-year-old version of Ted Bundy today, who still might be killing people. But Ted Bundy, as we knew him by that name in this time frame of his life frame that we know of, certainly hasn't hurt anyone again, and neither has Saddam Hussein or Hitler or any of these other people. So I'm just saying, on a material level, we can say, well, when Hitler presumably put a bullet in his head in the bunker, that was the last he was going to ever hurt anyone in this life. I mean, you would grant that. We could say Hitler may or may not have come to some self-realization, some self-actualization in another life, but the Hitler that we knew of ended on whatever date it was, April whatever of 45, and no one ever suffered directly because of Hitler's actions after that. Yes, there were still people in death camps for a few months and whatnot, and they may have suffered for years afterwards, but you know what I'm saying, in terms of he was able to do no more harm to last after whatever date that he finally ended himself.
Okay, first of all, you can't have anything like a Hitler unless you have a mass consciousness that supports it.
I don't doubt. Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
All right, so Hitler wasn't working alone. Let's put it that way.
And certainly Hitler didn't kill 10 million, 12 million, however many people by himself. He had many minions doing that for him.
Yes, of course, all sharing the same belief system.
Yeah,
a belief system that had to do basically with old hierarchies. Specifically Darwinian theory, the way it was understood then. I'm a very anti-Darwin person. That's nothing to do with being a creationist, but I think he was a very sloppy scientist. He had very little to work with, and he interpreted everything that he saw in the light of his own society. His cousin, by the way, was the person who developed the idea of eugenics. How bad can you get? And Darwin wrote himself that someday superior white man, it is written, biologically written, that superior white man will crush all the inferior races. That's the mentality Hitler came out of, and that mentality died with him. That's the amazing thing. As a governmental force, as a lead force in a nation, it died with him. That's amazing.
Well, the specific thing, I mean, people like Pol Pot came along in Cambodia 30 years later, and they had similar ideas of my class is better than the intellectuals and whatnot. So yes, maybe we can say pure Nazism, but there's all these people that are going to be looking for subhuman forms, that people they're going to consign to the lower depths.
It used to be done with measuring the head. That's the old anthropology.
Your physiognomy.
Right, well, the Asian people have larger skulls than we do.
Yeah.
And it's so obvious blind spots. They're so funny. And why try to establish the superiority thing over and over again?
Well,
what does that prove?
Okay. Well, let me just extrapolate a bit out though from humankind. You mentioned that from humankind. You mentioned that your belief in the block universe, and so I would presume that you would believe that even though you're not big on Darwin, that that certainly humans have evolved from lower forms of ape, and that at some point in the future we will evolve beyond Homo sapiens to Homo whatever.
I think the idea of a lower or higher anything is insane. That is so prejudicial, and no, I wouldn't agree with that at all. We're just beginning to understand the diversity of Homo sapiens of all types and other types of people in the Homo family. And we make, my God, what they did to the Neanderthal. Yeah. He can't speak. Well, in Israel, they found the larynx. He can't speak. And we have the artifacts from these people, and they did. We clubbed them to death. That was the old idea. We were superior. We extincted them. No, we married with them.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's this endless. We endlessly distort science. I did a whole class on this, by the way anthropology distorts history.
Okay.
The way it's taught. So no. I don't agree with anything about lower forms and evolution from lower forms whatsoever. And I think there are ways of thinking probably 50,000 years ago that are far superior, and the ways of perceiving that are far superior to what we're doing today.
Okay. Well, let me just
We measure this through technology. That is a real mistake.
let me ask this because one of the reasons I enjoy these kind of conversations is because a lot of times things come up that there's no way I'm prepared for. So let me just ask ask them.
That's good. Why
Yeah.
else would you do this?
Yeah. Well, let me ask about death though. And I want to give two specific examples. There are, you know, back a couple of decades ago, there was the idea of cryonics. The most famous being Ted Williams, the famous ball player who supposedly cut off his head and froze it to be reincarnated with a new body several hundred years from now. And also, there's the idea from a fellow, I mean, many people, but the most famous proponent of it is Ray Kurzweil with the idea of a singularity and uploading himself or his consciousness or our consciousnesses into artificial intelligence to attain, presumably, if not actual immortality, a lifespan multiple times more than our physical bodies can, you know, biologically sustain.
Well, there
What?
you go. There's the fear of death working, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Well, what do you think of both of those things, cryonics and artificial intelligence slash singularity?
Grow up.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I feel they should grow up. These people, they should grow up. We've grabbed at immortality. We do it by overpopulation. We do it with great wealth. We do it with fame. We've been doing this for a long time. What we should better do is understand where we're going and to not just accept it, but to embrace it. It's the best thing we could ever do is to die. It's the only thing that's going to save us is to die.
And when you say save, what do you mean save us
you are
from what?
never more dead than you are now.
Let me ask, when you said save us from what particularly?
Burning out, saving us from, you know, when you die, it's like you're in old clothes. Nothing fits anymore. You don't fit with your world anymore. You've done it. In order for us to rejuvenate, to revitalize, to go on, to restore our creative abilities and refuel the psyche, we have to die. Then it happens.
Well,
you know, we can't. Oh, by the way, we could die totally healthy if we had a better understanding of what that means to die. We could be totally healthy. We wouldn't have to wait until something took us, quote unquote, you know, that we fight against. Because death is not our friend, our find. I was going to say, death is not our enemy. Death is the best choice.
So, I mean, clearly, then you would probably be someone who would, you know, not be against someone like a Jack Kevorkian who would help to ease someone who is in a terminal illness. I would think you would support that kind of movement. That you, correct?
Yes, but I would try to understand what holds people back from dying naturally. I don't put any of my animals down. My husband and I are very much against it, for instance. Also, these laws can be quite abused, as they are in the Netherlands.
Well, I don't doubt anything can be abused. I mean,
yeah. Sure, people have a right to die anyway, in some way or another. We all commit suicide.
so where do you think in the near future and in the long future social ideas about death, and when I say social, I mean globally, or, you know, because we are moving towards a more global society as time gets on. I mean, for good or ill. Where do you think social ideas or social mores regarding death in, say, the near term of, say, 25 to 50 years and in a longer view of several centuries is headed? Do you think it's a good or positive omen? You know, where do you see us heading?
Well, I've had contact with this future incarnation 200 years from now. He does a lot of interdimensional communication, quite common. It's more conscious than the way we do it. We do it. We all do it. They just become very conscious and have learned how to technologically support it. The world will be less populated because people are not exhibiting their fear of death through overpopulation. So it's going to be considerably different, and we will survive. We're all in Western cultures, let's say cultures of the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, are very deeply apocalyptic in nature. It's not going to happen. No matter how hard we try, no matter how hard we want it, no matter how hard we can sell it, apocalypse will not happen. We are surviving, and in a better world.
In the future, it seems inevitable that humankind will leave the Earth. When you think of the future and think of death, do you, or like you mentioned, these, I guess you'd call them future incarnations, do do you see a cosmic view of other societies, other creatures, and would say an alien presence from let's say if there was something like people have postulated in science fiction books about sentient life forms made of just certain gas clouds floating in interstellar space, what long term, as humanity leaves not only the Earth but the solar system and ventures out, maybe even beyond the galaxy, uh, what is your idea of, say, the long term for humanity, ideas of death, and different kinds of life forms that we will encounter? Is there sort of the thing that there's a famous saying that slips my mind about many worlds in many ways, and the same kind of thing applying to death, that that we could have any kind of thing in common with other life forms, basically because we do die or everything dies. You know what I'm trying to say?
Sort of, I know what you're trying to say. Okay, let me try to break it down a little bit. For me, it's not important whether life forms are materialized, physicalized, or not. There's so many life forms that are in what we would consider non-material realities. The contact, massive. It's just massive. I think a lot of the sightings that we see are coming bleed through some other dimensions. I'm not convinced that all of it is physical. Some of it can be. So, but your emphasis on another planet, another physical thing, another life form that you can touch and see, and whatever, that for me is not important. What's important is to learn how to communicate with other realities, whether they're physicalized or not. Just imagine what that would do to our version of God. Blow us out of the water. And we have a lot to learn. It can be very exciting, and I think that some of us, when we die, will have those kinds of explorations. Many will, and more will. These new generations will probably not have the same kind of afterlife experience as their grandparents or great grandparents. Not at all. So, yeah, it's going to be pretty exciting, and this communication has become a very strong point of focus since Alexander Graham Bell. Maybe Morse code, I don't know. But communication is the big it in technology and everything else. And that drive is going to keep going until we begin to communicate with technological support. But generally, we are going to do it with much greater speed through telepathy. Telepathy is what we are. We're made out of it. It's what our cultures are about. And everybody is telepathic. Everything's telepathic. We couldn't survive without it. So once we've got that figured out, we can go in so many different directions with technological support, but not as primarily driven by technology. That change will happen in the next 150 or so years.
Well, do you think, I know when you talk telepathy, I'm thinking that you're talking biologically based, but I know people, Google and things are trying to develop little implants. Do you think that things like that will enhance or deter what you might call more natural telepathy? So let's say if you had something that could plug into the cortex of the mind, some kind of silicon device in 10, 20 years, based on this Google Glasses kind of thing, do you think that that would be something that would help enable people? Well, for example, and what are your views on, say, mushrooms and more pharmacologically based mind enhancers, say from the 1960s? Do you think that they help, or do they occlude reality as you see it?
Well, again, there's several questions there. The first one is, let me see, try to remember what you said
About
about
the Google?
implants and things like.
Yeah.
I think it may teach us what actually is going on, but eventually we have to become independent of it. Um, we just always fall back on something material, something that's an instrument of some kind, in order to be sure of something, to give it validity, for instance. And there will be a time when we don't need that validation anymore from materialistic science. It will come. It's going to be short-lived, science's peak. I'm sure the Big Bang Theory is already on its way out. No, I mean, I've been expecting that for a while. I think I've been expecting for a while, too, that the gravity is not one of the major force fields. I mean, you know, at least they're getting somewhere. Anyway, as to the second question, I think once you reorder your brain chemistry, you're not necessarily, it's good in terms of learning other perceptions, that there are other levels of perception. It's also good to remember your dreams, especially lucid dreaming, to learn how to develop that, because we experience other levels of reality, whereas drug stuff is basically hallucination. Not that there can't be genuine experience in that, but it's basically hallucination, and that's not what I'm driving for. I'm driving for something that is a part of some kind of reality.
Okay, well, let's end this segment here, and in our final segment, I'll just give you a few minutes to sum up your thoughts on death. Also, you could talk a little bit maybe about your book, and we'll do that when we return. Well, I've been speaking the last hour or so with Julia Assante. She's the author of a book called The Last Frontier. She's been talking about her ideas about life, death, and a lot of other things associated with both. As I do, I'd like to give her a few minutes to just sum up her thoughts. Also, if she wants to talk a little bit about the general thrust of the book, that's okay. So, Julia, if you would.
A summary of my thoughts?
Yeah, summary of your thoughts. You know,
right.
Someone who's just come upon your work or this show. If you could just sort of give a little sort of précis of what you are and what you believe in, kind of thing.
Okay, first I'd like to mention that a summary of my thoughts could be more extensively realized if people go to my website. Can I give that address?
Yeah, and I'll link to it below. Go ahead.
www.juliaassante, that's one word, .com.
Okay.
Really simple.
Yeah.
And there you'll find me, or you can just Google my name, or Google The Last Frontier, Exploring the Afterlife, Transforming Our Fear of Death. That's the name of the book. So let me just say that.
Okay.
I would say that we should really live life from a different perspective. We should live life from the perspective of what would we be thinking on our deathbeds? Would this be important? What is important? What has meaning and value to us? What would be important from the view of being dead? Extremely alive, but in our terms dead. When we look back on our lives, what are we trying to achieve? And why are we trying to achieve it? To please other people? To conform to a certain kind of identity? When you start to open up the idea of being an eternal self, and you start really accepting that, your individual, massively, rigorously, aggressively alive, curious, and creative immortality, what's important? And follow that. Because then, when you've sifted what's important from what isn't, all the little problems, all the fears around your security issues really drop off. I've lived in 5 countries because I don't have that. Most people won't leave, especially in Europe, the town they were born in. So we live for security for what? We're always secure whether we're alive or dead. We cannot be destroyed. So I routinely do this. I routinely either go to my deathbed, which I know very well and when, or I think about it in terms of seeing my life after I've left it. What does that look like? What am I fighting for? What am I afraid of? And once we start to live in that perspective, your life becomes immeasurably rich. But we need to embrace that now. We need to embrace the fact that death is not our enemy. It's the best thing that could ever happen to us, and it is pure magic.
Well, let me just ask one final question before I let you go. In the next handful of years or so, if you could say, I want to accomplish this, or I want to enlighten people or society about one particular thing, what would that be? The most important thing, say.
That you're never more dead than you are now. That this whole thing we've been brought up with about judgment is about self-forgiveness. The judgment issue is a control measure. Sin was created around 500, 600 BC. There wasn't any sin before then as we know it. No offense against a god other than you forgot his birthday. Something like that. Okay, so we need to relieve ourselves of many of these terrible social, mental, emotional burdens and understand our inner freedom and work with it, our inner security and work with it. Basically, to live more like other animals. We need to stop looking for immortality in material goods and in producing more children than this earth can handle.
All right.
It's not going to be there.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for spending some time with me speaking about this. As you mentioned, juliassante.com is the website. You can see the link below. Her book is The Last Frontier. And again, thank you for your time.